Samuel Taylor Coleridge studied at Oxford, where he met Robert Southey. The two of them were thinking of founding a new ideal society called pantisocracy, which comes from the Greek words pan plus isos plus kratos, that is, the power, an equal power given to all people. It was originally meant to be formed by 12 people. Coleridge and Southey married two sisters, and pantisocracy would have started from the four of them. First, they thought of establishing this pantisocracy in Pennsylvania, United States, then to Wales, but finally the project failed, and Coleridge moved to Dorsetshire, where he met William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy. The two made friends and both became poets. They were later nicknamed the Lake Poets, as they lived together in the Lake region, in the Lake District of Dorset. They published the Lyrical ballads in 1798. They traveled to Germany and came into contact with the German philosophers, especially Immanuel Kant, who was the first philosopher who would lay the basis for Romanticism. But Wordsworth and Coleridge had already published their collection of poems when they learned this new philosophy, and when they decided to become a part of this new literary form, this new literary school that is Romanticism. So the only thing they could do was writing and adding a preface to this collection of poems, which they published again 2 years later. While in Germany, Coleridge learned German and the German philosophy. Wordsworth used to be alone with his sister, and he wrote the Lucy poems. The preface to the Lyrical ballads is universally considered the manifesto of English Romanticism, because in the preface both Wordsworth and Coleridge explained their writing technique and the reasons why they made poetry. First of all, they define as their content, as the content of their poems, episodes taken from the simple life in the countryside. Nothing special, only pure, simple episodes taken from living in the countryside. This is important because after the Industrial Revolution broke out, everybody in England seemed to have lost the love for nature. The man-nature relationship seemed to be broken. So the Lake Poets are important because they try to recreate that contact between man and nature. Second, the style. The style in writing was obviously simple. The poet is defined as a man talking to other men using a simple language. The language must be simple. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. Both Wordsworth and Coleridge refused the strict codes of the so-called poetic diction. Poetic diction was based on classical poetry. It was a classical way of making poetry. Romantic poets, and Wordsworth and Coleridge are the first examples of the first generation of Romantic poets, had to keep it simple, to keep the language simple as possible. As regards the writing technique, the poetic technique, When the poet is fascinated by the landscape, the panorama of nature, for example, a rainbow, a sea of flowers, a lake, the trees, he gets emotional, but that's not the moment when he has to make poetry, when he has to create poetry. He has to wait for some time, and then he has to recollect that emotion, but in a moment, in a state of tranquility, when he is alone. After some time, he can recollect that emotion, that strong emotion, and he can make poetry. That is the idea of a recollection in tranquility. The most important poems written by Wordsworth that we can find in the Lyrical Ballads, which is a collection of both Wordsworth and Coleridge's poems, are My Heart Leaps Up, Daffodils, also called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and Upon Westminster Bridge. In My Heart Leaps Up, the poet describes the feeling, the emotion that he feels on looking at a rainbow. He says that his heart leaps up, that is, gets emotional, when he sees, when he admires the beauty of a rainbow. And he adds that so it was when he was a child, because only a child has this power of imagination, only a child is able to be constantly surprised by the beauty of nature. But then he says that he is a man, he is a poet, so he shares a child's sensibility, a child's ability of imagining, other words, of looking at nature with the eyes of a child. And he also says that if someday he doesn't feel any emotion in front of the spectacle, in front of the beauty of nature, it will mean that he is spiritually dead. A man, a poet, is spiritually dead when he doesn't feel anything, any emotion in front of the spectacle of nature, the beauty of nature. Daffodils. A daffodil is a flower, is a golden flower. It corresponds to Italian narciso. It is also called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, because the first line of this poem is I wandered lonely as a cloud when suddenly I was surprised, I was shocked by the view of a sea of golden daffodils. So at first the poet feels alone, and this can make us think back of Francesco Petrarca when he said solo e pensoso i più deserti campi vo misurando. But this feeling of solitude lasts only for a while, because then nature, which is a spiritual guide, a companion, a friend to man, if man is able to reunite with nature, nature becomes his best friend. And so does nature in this poem. He is no longer alone. He is fascinated by the beauty of these flowers, of these golden flowers, and they are pictured while they are dancing in the breeze. It's important to notice the use of the verb to dance, because it is as if these flowers were alive, they could move. The poet is fascinated by the flowers, and he adds, I did not think of what was happening inside of me, inside of my mind, my heart, because that view, the spectacle of the beauty of these flowers, was much more important than that unique feeling that he felt on that day. Because even afterwards, even in the future, when he is alone, in the ugly atmosphere, in the ugly environment of the industrial town, he will think back of those flowers, and he will look at them not with his real eyes, but with his inward eye, that secret eye that a poet has inside of him, the eye of imagination. So even in the future, he will be able to recollect the beauty of those flowers, the beauty of nature. He will recollect that feeling, and he will be happy. In fact, he says it is the bliss of solitude. It is the happiness of contemplating the beauty of a memory, because it's just the beauty of a memory. He is not in front of nature anymore, but he thinks back of the daffodils and he feels happy, and in tranquility he is able to make poetry. The only but very huge contribution given by Samuel Taylor Coleridge to the lyrical ballads is represented by the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a very long poem in the form of a story. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a ballad, a very long poem, which describes how an ancient mariner compels some poor man, the wedding guests, who are on their way to a wedding party, to sit down and listen. They have to listen to his terrible, incredible story. The mariner starts telling of a terrible voyage he was having with his crew. A beautiful albatross flies around his ship and stops there to have some rest. The mariners welcome the albatross as a sign, as a symbol of peace, a sort of peace after the storm, the quiet, the peace after the storm. But the mariner, for no reason, kills the albatross. It is an act of pure violence, of pure cruelty, which in a way represents the crimes against nature constantly committed by man, especially after the Industrial Revolution, because we must not forget that after the Industrial Revolution broke out, nature stopped being a sweet companion for man and becomes the source of raw materials for industries, for factories. So the mariner is a sinner he commits a crime against nature when he killed the albatross with no reason. The nightmare starts at that very moment. The weather changes, the wind doesn't blow anymore, the ship stops at one point which is indefinite in the huge ocean, and the mariner and his crew are isolated, paralyzed, isolated from the rest of the world. Suddenly, a skeleton ship appears. On this skeleton ship, two terrible characters, Death and Life and Death, are playing dice. They are casting dice because they want to win the mariner or his crew. Death wins the mariners, so they all die. Life and Death wins the mariner, who does not die but falls into a state of life and death, a sort of limbo, a sort of a parallel dimension which is isolated from the rest of the world, isolated from nature, and all he can do is sitting and looking at the corpses of his crew. All these men dead, lying on the ground, and around him only the ocean. That is the worst moment for the mariner, where he really feels how isolated he has become for committing this crime against nature. But suddenly something happens. The water snakes, some terrible snakes appear among the waves, and the mariner, for the first time, looks at these creatures and starts appreciating their colors, the fact that they are alive, they are natural creatures, so they were made by God. And that is the moment when his redemption starts. He has now understood the importance of nature, the importance of being in harmony with nature, and is now able to go back to the community of human beings to tell them his story. And that's what he is making with this wedding guest. He has stopped. He forces this young man to listen to all his story, because he has to learn the lesson. What lesson? Nature must be respected. Nature is a friend to man, and man must recreate this relationship, this direct relationship with nature, which had been broken by the Industrial Revolution. So, while Wordsworth describes nature in its genuine, simple, everyday aspects, a rainbow, a sea of flowers, a sea of daffodils, Coleridge describes nature in a very overwhelming, transcendental, we may say, a way. Nature is described in a sublime atmosphere. We must not forget that in his essay on the sublime, Edmund Burke defined the sublime as something which paralyzes reason, which hypnotizes the one who looks at a sublime thing, such as a scorpion, such as a spider, and when reason is paralyzed, that's when imagination can start acting, can start working. In another work of his, the Biographia Literaria, Coleridge gives his definition of imagination. We have to distinguish between primary and secondary imagination and fancy. Fancy is the lowest condition of imagination. Fancy only consists of thinking, of collecting ideas. Primary imagination is the ability of putting these ideas together. The secondary imagination is the most active part of the imagination process. The secondary imagination makes these new things created by imagination live. So it was secondary imagination which created the skeleton ship, death, life in death, and made them move, and made them actually act. Ferma un attimo.